Thank you, Senator Runciman. Senator Joyal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question would be for Ms. Kane. Ms. Kane, you are responsible with the criminal law policy section at the department. In the process of developing that legislation that we have under consideration, what kind of impact studies you made on the various, should say, vulnerable population of Canadians that could be affected by this legislation? Or I should maybe phrase it differently. Did you ever make impact studies of contemplated criminal changes that you study generally?
Senator, in the policy development process, we look at a number of considerations in terms of how various options will impact on, as you say, vulnerable populations, women, Aboriginal persons, the full range, the diversity of Canadian society.
Like diabetic, HIV people, people who are fighting with a permanent disease that cannot be cured but just controlled, for instance?
Well, not necessarily to that level of specificity, but we're looking at the implications of reforms to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to deal with trafficking and production, not looking at issues with respect to the use of those drugs. People with medical conditions may be prescribed those drugs, if that's what you're referring to. I'm not quite clear.
No, that's not exactly. I'm talking of the vulnerability of people. Let me give you an example. If you have a person who has HIV and that person is found guilty under this act, that person is sent in prison. In prison, that person adds to the overall responsibility of the federal government to deal with a prisoner which suffers from HIV. And the correctional director of services will tell you that there are all kinds of implications in relation to that. So what I'm asking you is that when you draft a legislation at Justice Department, are you measuring the impact that legislation, proposed legislation or contemplated legislation or options that you are considering will have on vulnerable clients, quote unquote, that you will fish in that net that you're going to throw on the Canadian population?
With respect to the example you gave, which is a good example, when we are looking at the implications for the legislation, in this case, we looked at the impact being that more people would be serving time in federal institutions, some people would be serving time in provincial institutions, and because of that, our colleagues at the Correctional Services do provide that information for the consideration of ministers about how they deal with vulnerable populations in the correctional system. And all of those factors are considered when options are considered or are developed. We provide those options, and decisions are made by the government in terms of which options they will pursue. I believe you're hearing from colleagues at the Correctional Services of Canada who have a variety of programs to address the many needs of the offenders who are housed in their institutions, and they may be able to indicate how they deal with people that have long-term chronic illnesses or other very serious illnesses in prison.
So you have in front of you impact studies on vulnerable population in dealing with or appraising the options that you have in front of you when you draft a legislation?
I wouldn't necessarily refer to such things as impact studies. We look at all the considerations and all the information about the implications of various options when legislation is being developed.
But impact is a different evaluation, quote unquote, than just an increase of population in prisons, for instance. In other words, I want to try to get from you how much refinement you have of your understanding of the impact of the proposed changes to the criminal code vis-a-vis the vulnerable population that will find itself caught by that legislation. You seem to circle around and not wanted to answer directly. That's the impression I
have answered to the best of my ability that we look at the implications of various options. We don't always start out with the option that you see before you in a bill. we present various options for the reform of the law to the government for their consideration, and there are implications, pros and cons of various options. And when we're looking at anything that has penalties that will have an impact on the prison population in the provinces or in the Correctional Service of Canada, the Correctional Service of Canada looks at the implications for their prison population, whether that be man or woman, and where they would be housed. And they have very sophisticated techniques for trying to estimate where that population will increase. It won't be necessarily in one region or the other, and how they will house those individuals, and what the costs will be into the future, including the special programs. And that information is considered in terms of assessing the options. At the end of the day, there are many pros and cons with various options, and the government chooses the option best able to implement the policy objectives.
But you have access to those studies in considering the options that you will recommend to the minister.
Those implications are looked at, and
Look at by who?
they are part of the process when we develop options for the consideration of the government, where they're available. And I cannot speak for the Correctional Service of Canada in terms of the level of detail that they pursue in terms of the impact on a particular offender who may be convicted and sentenced to time in a federal institution, whether that person has HIV or any of the other illnesses that you noted. I don't know that they go down to that level of specificity. They certainly look at gender, and they look at Aboriginal population, and they look at age, and so on.
They're looking at gender, they're looking at Aboriginals. I hope they're looking at income distribution, poor versus the well-off who can afford to hire fancy lawyers. They do look at those things. There are analyses available of the implications of the option that was ultimately chosen. Can this committee have that information?
I will have to, sorry, I'm having trouble. I will have to inquire about what can be made available. I understood Senator Joyal's comment to be about those people in prison. Obviously, information about income distribution and your question about whether they would be hiring representation is a slightly different question. I don't want to overcommit to what we may be able to provide to the committee.
You understand my reason? Why I ask you those questions is that we are asked for to say yes or no or qualify our answer to this bill. And I try to understand, as a rational, reasonable person, what is the information at the root of this option that has been enshrined into this piece of paper. That's essentially what I'm trying to understand. I'm not trying to deconstruct the legislation. I'm trying to have the rational approach that any reasonable person would have to try to understand the impacts of this bill when it's going to be enacted.
Okay, Senator Joyal, we'll let the officials answer, but then if you want more questioning, I'm going to have to put you down for a second round if we have time for one.
Thank you.
Did you want to add?
I don't think I can add anything more.
Senator Lang, followed by Senator Baker and Senator Green-Rain.
Madam Chair, I know time is moving on here. It's 5 to 6, and I'm hoping that we're going to be completed by 6:15 as per our schedule. As an observation, I want to go back to the question of mandatory sentencing. And there seems to be an ideological divide between some members of the committee here in respect to whether or not there should or shouldn't be these mandatory sentences versus the discretion of the court. And I get the impression, as I'm a new member here, and I guess I can't say I'm new for very much longer.
Not new anymore.
That's right. That the impression is being left that the mandatory sentencing is something new and something that's just been brought in by the present government. And I just was wondering, for the record, if you could tell us if there's mandatory, other legislation with mandatory sentences, and maybe give us an idea of when we started putting in the mandatory sentencing.
Well, we do have mandatory sentences with respect to firearms. Those were, I believe, came in force in the 90s, mid-90s. We've had mandatory minimums with respect to impaired driving that have been around for longer. We did have a mandatory minimum with respect to the importation of drugs since the 60s, but that was struck down because the minimum in that case was a minimum 7 years, and it was a blanket minimum, so there were no aggravating factors at all. So it didn't matter how much, what the quantity. Actually, it predates Mr. Trudeau.
We're all to that one. Four of you.
Well, the minimum drugs go back to 1960. So they have been around for some time.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on this, because I think it's important, and I think I'm sure that my colleague Senator Baker would agree that we don't want to leave the viewers out there with the impression that this is something draconian that's been brought in here in the last 2 days. So I think that's important, and also maybe for the record, perhaps you could just give us a brief overview on other countries like the United States and other countries in the free world. I assume they have mandatory sentences for certain crimes that the society feels are appropriate. Perhaps you could expand on that.
There are actually mandatory minimums in the drugs area is something that is fairly common in foreign legislation, and it's not just, for instance, in Asia or in South America. Even countries like Sweden, I believe, and Germany have minimum penalties. Now, the way they operate, and I'm not very familiar with all of those. I just know that they exist out there, and they're structured more than likely differently than the way this is structured, but they are out there. So I think that's the extent to which I can provide you information on that.
Entry, if I might, if we're asking for information to be provided, if there are studies on the impact in Canada of the mandatory minimums that we have had, particularly anything we may have learned about their deterrent effect, would you provide those? We're giving you lots and lots of homework. Forgive me, Senator Lang.
I'm sorry, you're asking if there are studies? Well,
in use in the department. I mean, I know university professors have been busily studying these things madly, but I'm more interested in, as is Senator Joel, I guess, in understanding the evidence that led to the reasoning that led to drafting of legislation as it is. The Minister has given us eloquent explanation of the political philosophy that underlies this bill and indeed others. We're now looking for the technical work at your end, at your level. Forgive me, Senator Lang, I'm interrupting, but that doesn't count as part of your time.
Well, I'm satisfied. I don't need the studies. Quite frankly, I'm quite satisfied with the fact that there should be mandatory sentences for certain crimes that have been committed, and it depends on how we around this table view those crimes and how serious those crimes are. I believe trafficking in drugs in a schoolyard is dangerous and is something that there has to be consequences. I just want to make one point, because I know there's other questions here on the treatment, question of treatment and availability in the North. And my friend Senator Watt made the sweeping statement that there wasn't any treatment facilities available in the North. Well, from our part of the country, there are some programs in effect. I just want to put that on the record.
That's in the Yukon.
Yes.
That would be how far from, let us say, Iqaluit? A couple of thousand miles?
But I am in the North.
Yeah.
Madam Chairman, I just wanted to point out, you asked about studies that the Department of Justice had done in the area of...
Or used.
We did submit, I think, 2 reports that have been commissioned by the Department dealing with MMPs, and I believe that you received those at the last time we were here.
Is there anything else that we can add to that?
I don't believe there's anything new that's been done.
Okay, because this incarnation of the committee has taken on board all the evidence that was presented a year ago